The looters had taken the silver and the silk. But they had left the house's heartbeat behind because they did not know how to listen for the steady rhythm of stone. To the debt collectors and the scavengers who had picked the rooms clean over the last 3 winters, Oakhaven Priory was a mere carcass, a rotting monument to a family that had fallen from the king's grace. To Clara Sterling, however, it was a complex mathematical equation waiting for its final variable to be solved. For $2, she did not merely purchase the hollowed shell of a manor. She bought the only vault in the county that used the weight of the house itself as a combination lock. As the morning fog clung to the damp limestone of the courtyard, Clara stood among a crowd of men who saw only a ruin. They did not know that she had spent her girlhood tracing the secret veins of this house, while her father, Thomas Sterling, taught her that stone never lies, even when men do. The air in the courtyard was thick with the scent of wet wool and the sharp, metallic tang of an approaching frost. It was a cold that seemed to seep through the soles of her boots, a reminder of the years she had spent in the shadows of the parish workhouse, learning the precise shape of being unseen. Clara stood at the periphery of the auction, her hands tucked into the pockets of a gown made of faded sarcenet. The fabric had once been vibrant, but it was now the color of a winter sky just before the snow falls. Beside her, the villagers and the minor gentry of Kent gathered like crows around a fallen beast, their breath blossoming in the grey air as they waited for the magistrate to begin the proceedings. They looked at the boarded windows of Oakhaven and saw an eyesore, a tragedy of bad debt and embezzlement. They did not see the cantilevered lie of the Eastern Bloc, nor did they understand the phantom load that the central pillars were still carrying with a silent, structural dignity. Magistrate Barnaby Wickham stood upon a makeshift platform of salt-rotted timber, his face a map of broken veins and practiced arrogance. He was a man who thrived on the enforcement of social hierarchies, his very presence a reminder that the law was a tool for the powerful and a cage for the rest. He adjusted his spectacles, looking down at the ledger in his hands with a sneer that seemed etched into his features by decades of petty triumphs. To him, Clara was nothing more than the ghost of a traitor's daughter, a nuisance who had appeared from the mist to witness the final indignity of her family's former home. He did not realize that she was the only person present who understood the skeletal anatomy of the structure, the hidden engineering that kept the house's secrets tucked behind 3 feet of reinforced masonry. The auction of the furniture and the tapestries had happened months ago, leaving only the land and the stone structure for today's final sale. Wickham cleared his throat, the sound like gravel grinding in a barrel as he looked out over the shivering crowd. "The house has been stripped," he announced, his voice carrying over the murmurs of the men. "There is no lead left on the roof, the pipes have been cut, and the very floorboards in the gallery have been pried up for kindling. It is a shell, gentlemen, a dangerous, crumbling shell that Lord Vane has seen fit to release from his holdings. Who will offer a pittance for the privilege of tearing it down for the lime?" He laughed then, a dry, hacking sound that was mirrored by the men in the front row. They were all Lord Julian Vane's men, sent to ensure that no one of substance would bid on the property, keeping it a barren wasteland that Vane could eventually reclaim for a song when the taxes became too burdensome. Clara stepped forward, the movement quiet and deliberate, as if she were navigating a room full of sleeping hounds. The crowd parted, not out of respect, but out of a confused curiosity. She could feel the weight of their judgment, the way they took in her frayed cuffs and the lack of a proper bonnet. She was a woman who should have been seeking an annuity or a position as a governess, not standing in the mud of an estate auction. $2, she said. Her voice was not loud, but it possessed the unwavering chill of the winter air that follows a sudden frost. It was a clear, steady sound that seemed to cut through Wickham's mockery. The magistrate paused, his gavel hovering in the air like a stunned insect. He looked at her, his eyes narrowing as he recognized the girl who had once been the surveyor's shadow. $2, Clara Sterling? Wickham asked, his lip curling in a display of performative disbelief. You would spend your last coins on a pile of rubble that the crown itself has abandoned. You cannot even afford the tallow to light a single room in that tomb. He looked to his companions, inviting them to join in the jest. Perhaps she intends to live in the cellar with the rats, one of the men shouted, and a wave of cruel laughter rippled through the courtyard. Clara did not flinch. She had learned long ago that the opinions of men who do not understand the math of a structure are as fleeting as the steam from a kettle. The legal requirement for a public auction of a derelict estate is a minimum bid to satisfy the transfer of deed, she replied, her tone clinical and devoid of the shame they expected. I am offering that bid. Wickham's amusement faded, replaced by a dull irritation. He wanted to be done with the cold, to retreat to the warmth of the tavern and the flattery of his peers. He looked at the ledger, then at the silent, brooding mass of the house behind her. It was a ruin that no one wanted, a liability that even Lord Vane's agents were hesitant to touch until the legal encumbrances were cleared. Fine, he spat, the word hitting the air like a stone. $2 for the carcass of Oakhaven Priory. Going once to the girl who has clearly lost her wits as well as her station. He didn't even wait for a second bid, the gavel coming down with a sharp final crack against the wood. Sold to the daughter of the embezzler. May you find the damp to your liking. The laughter followed Clara as she took the heavy iron key from the clerk, Mr. Penhaligon, who watched her with a gaze that was uncharacteristically soft. He was a meticulous man who had likely seen the true ledgers before Lord Vane had them altered, and for a moment she saw a flicker of something like pity in his eyes. He knew that Oakhaven had been ransacked by Vane's own men under the guise of debt collection, and he surely believed she was buying a tomb for her own memories. Clara thanked him quietly, the iron of the key biting into her palm, a cold, solid reality that outweighed the insults of the crowd. She did not look back at the magistrate or the villagers as she turned and walked toward the great hall. She could feel the house waiting for her, its silence no longer a threat, but a sanctuary. When the heavy oak door groaned open, the sound was a long, delayed breath echoing through the vestibule. Clara stepped inside, and the world of Magistrate Wickham and his petty cruelties vanished, replaced by the smell of old dust, dry rot, and the faint, lingering scent of beeswax from a decade ago. The looters had indeed been thorough. The grand staircase was as skeletal remains of its former glory, its mahogany railings ripped away for their value in timber. The marble tiles of the foyer had been chipped and broken where men had searched for hidden caches of coin that did not exist. Every wall had been tapped, every floorboard tested by the hammers of the desperate and the greedy. They had searched for the obvious, the gold, the jewels, the silver plate. But they had found nothing, because they were looking for wealth that could be carried in a sack. She walked through the empty rooms, her footsteps sounding like the steady beat of a drum against the bare stone. She was not looking at the missing tapestries or the scarred plaster. Instead, she was looking at the way the light fell across the lintels of the doorways and the precise angle of the joists in the ceiling. Her father had taught her that a house is not merely a collection of rooms. It is a living body of stone and pressure. He had been the king's surveyor, a man who could look at a mountain and tell you where the water would flow before the first rain fell. Before Lord Vane had framed him, before the ledgers were stolen and their name was dragged through the mud of the London courts, he had shown Clara the blueprints of Oakhaven. He had whispered to her that the house held a secret that no ransacker would ever find, because it was hidden not behind a door, but within the very physics of the architecture. The eastern block was where the discrepancy lived. As Clara moved into the long gallery, she could feel the shift in the air, the way the temperature seemed to drop as the walls thickened. Most people would have assumed it was merely the lack of sunlight, but she knew it was the density of the limestone. She stopped at the central pillar, a massive column of stone that was supposed to support the weight of the library above. She let her hand rest against the cold surface, feeling the subtle vibration of the house as the wind buffeted the exterior walls. According to the official survey, this pillar was solid, but as she traced the edge of the molding with her thumb, Clara remembered the sketches in her father's forbidden journal, The Equilibrium of Stones. He had noted a 6-inch discrepancy in the wall thickness in that section, a gap that should not exist if the load-bearing calculations were to be believed. The ransackers had beaten these walls with sledgehammers, looking for hollow spaces, but they had found only the resistance of solid rock. They did not understand that the void was not empty. It was pressurized by the weight of the floors above, a pocket of atmospheric stillness held in place by 40,000 pounds of phantom load. To enter the strong room of Oakhaven, one did not need a key or an axe. One needed to understand the cantilevered lie that redirected the house's massive weight through a series of hidden arches. The looters had seen only a ruin, but as Clara stood in the growing gloom of the afternoon, she found the map of their own destruction. The house was a masterpiece of shadow engineering, a secret hidden in plain sight by a man who knew that the most secure vault is one that appears to be part of the very bones of the world. She knelt on the floor, ignoring the dust that clung to her skirts, and pulled a small brass plumb line from her pocket. It was the only thing of her father's that she had managed to keep, a tool of precision in a world of chaotic lies. She watched the weight swing, measuring the tilt of the floorboards relative to the central pillar with a focused, clinical intensity. The house was settling, as all old things do, but it was settling with a mathematical grace that told her the strong room was still intact, its seal unbroken by the violence of the looters. They had taken the silk and the silver, leaving behind only the cold stone and the silence. But in that silence, Clara could hear the faint, rhythmic sound of the house breathing, the slow, steady pulse of a legacy that refused to be buried. She was no longer the invisible girl in the faded dress. She was the owner of Oakhaven, and she was about to prove that the most valuable things in this world are the ones that the blind and the arrogant have discarded as worthless. Her fingers traced a hairline fracture in the masonry, and for the first time in 3 winters, she felt a spark of foundational hope. The first night in the hollowed belly of Oakhaven Priory was not an act of sleep, but an act of communion. Clara Sterling lay upon the cold, hard expanse of the gallery floor, her only bedding a thin woolen cloak that smelled of the damp parish workhouse she had finally escaped. The darkness here was absolute, a thick velvet shroud that seemed to swallow the very memory of the sun. Yet it was in this deprivation that her senses began to sharpen. To the looters who had come before, the absence of light was a hindrance to be overcome with torches and fire. To a surveyor's daughter, it was a canvas upon which the house wrote its most honest truths. She did not close her eyes against the blackness. Instead, she let the silence settle over her until it reached a specific, biting resonance, the exact temperature of silence that exists only when stone is under immense unspoken pressure. She began her survey not with sight, but with the subtle, rhythmic drift of sound. It was a technique her father, Thomas Sterling, had called the acoustic map, a way of seeing through the skin of a building to the bones beneath. Clara reached into her pocket and produced a single, worn silver crown, the last of her currency. She did not intend to spend it, but to use it as a probe. She flicked the coin upward, listening to the sharp, crystalline ring as it struck the floorboards 3 feet away. In the great hall, the sound had been flat and dissipated, swallowed by the vast empty volume of the room. But here, in the shadow of this corridor's central pillar, the note returned to her with a strange, metallic shimmer, a secondary vibration that suggested the floor was not merely a surface, but a diaphragm stretched tight over a void. She moved with the slow, deliberate grace of a predator in a landscape of shadows, tapping the coin against the base of the walls at precise intervals. One tap produced the sharp ring of solid limestone, dense and unyielding. Another strike brought the dry, brittle thud of a lath and plaster partition. She was looking for the thrum, that elusive low-frequency vibration that occurs when a structural load is improperly balanced or when a hidden cavity acts as a resonator. The looters had used sledgehammers, blunt instruments of the blind, but Clara used the weight of her own breath and the resonance of silver. She followed the drift of the wind as it whistled through the broken window panes, noting how the drafts did not merely blow through the rooms, but seemed to be sucked toward the central spine of the wing, as if the house were inhaling through a hidden lung. By the time the moon had climbed high enough to cast a pale, skeletal light through the rafters, Clara had identified a 3-yard stretch of the interior wall that did not speak the language of the rest of the house. When she tapped the stone here, the sound did not die. It lingered, a ghostly echo that seemed to travel downward into the very foundations. It was a hollow thrum, but not the hollowness of a simple cupboard or a priest hole. It was the sound of air under pressure, a trapped atmosphere held in stasis by the sheer mass of the masonry surrounding it. She pressed her ear to the cold limestone, closing her eyes to better hear the house's internal heartbeat. Beneath the groan of the settling timber and the rattle of the sash, there was a steady, rhythmic sigh, the sound of air moving through a chimney that no one had ever built. She remained there for hours, a silhouette of quiet resilience against the backdrop of a ruined legacy. She was not merely looking for a room. She was listening for the water, not the wheel. She understood that the looters had failed because they had looked for the obvious seams, the hidden latches, and the hollow echoes of a desperate man's hiding place. They had expected Oakhaven Priory to be a riddle with a simple answer. Clara knew better. Her father had designed the Priory's restoration years ago, and he had been a master of shadow engineering, a discipline that didn't hide things behind doors, but within the very physics of the structure itself. To find what was hidden, one had to find the lie in the math, the moment where the weight of the world didn't add up to the sum of its parts. The realization came to her as the first grey light of dawn began to bleed through the dust-moated air. Clara stood back from the central pillar, her eyes tracking the lines of the ceiling joists and the massive oak lintels that spanned the gallery. She pulled the brass plumb line from her pocket once more, the small weight catching the morning light with a dull, golden glint. She suspended the line from the edge of the molding, watching as it settled into a perfect, vertical stillness. Then, using a piece of charred wood from the cold hearth, she marked the exact point on the floor where the weight touched. She moved 10 feet down the wall and repeated the measurement, then once more at the far end of the wing. When she stepped back to look at her marks, the breath left her lungs in a sharp, cold plume. The central pillar was not where the blueprint said it should be. It was shifted exactly 6 inches to the west, a discrepancy so small that to the casual observer, it was invisible, yet to an eye trained in the geometry of loads, it was a structural impossibility. A pillar of that size, supporting the weight of the library and the lead roof above, could not be moved 6 inches without causing the entire ceiling to sag, unless that 6-inch shift was being compensated for by a cantilevered arch hidden within the wall itself. The entire eastern annex was a cantilevered lie, a masterpiece of architectural deception where the weight of 20 tons of stone was being redirected through a series of pressurized voids. The looters had searched for a strong room, expecting it to be a room within the house. Clara realized then that the strong room was the house. The entire central core of the wing was a hollowed-out spine, a vault of immense proportions that was held shut by the very gravity that should have crushed it. The 6-inch discrepancy was the key. By shifting the pillar, Thomas Sterling had created a structural lock that relied on equilibrium, rather than iron. To open it, one did not need to pry or break. One had to shift the center of gravity just enough to allow the stones to breathe. It was a revelation that hit her with the force of a physical blow, a mixture of awe for his genius and a deep, simmering anger at the men who had called him a common thief. She walked the length of the gallery again, her fingers tracing the edge of the limestone blocks. She could see it now. The way the masonry was fitted with a precision that bordered on the obsessive. There were no mortar lines here, only the perfect interlocking geometry of stone against stone. The looters had seen a wall they couldn't break, never realizing they were standing on the threshold of the most secure vault in the kingdom. They had mocked her for buying a ruin for $2. Yet, as she stood in the center of the gallery, Clara felt the first real weight of her inheritance. It was not a gift of gold or land, but a gift of truth, a legacy of hidden strength that Julian Vane and his scavengers were too arrogant to ever comprehend. She knelt by the base of the pillar, her hands moving over the stone with the reverence of a scholar. She had evolved past being merely the daughter of Thomas Sterling. She was the architect of his vindication. The house ceased to be a carcass to be picked clean. It was a living mechanism, a silent witness waiting for the right hand to set it in motion. The cold of the morning no longer felt like a threat, but like a bracing clarity. She looked up at the towering height of the pillar, noting the subtle way the light caught a thin, horizontal seam near the base, a seam that the looters had surely dismissed as a natural fissure in the rock. But Clara knew it was the hinge of the world, the precise point where the weight of Oakhaven met the secret it had been built to protect. She didn't attempt to move the stone yet. The labor of restoration required more than just the knowledge of the secret. It required the patience of the mason and the precision of the surveyor. She had to calculate the exact counterweight needed to offset that immense phantom load before the structural lock would yield. If she moved too quickly, the cantilever would collapse, burying the secrets of the iron box forever beneath a mountain of rubble. She stood up, her gown of faded sarsenet rustling against the stone, and walked toward the small pile of dry wood she had gathered. She would need a fire, not just for warmth, but to provide the steady, consistent light required for the meticulous work of the coming days. As she struck the flint, the first sparks dancing in the gloom, Clara felt a profound sense of quietude settle over her. The world outside, with its magistrates and its creditors and its social shaming, felt like a distant, flickering dream. Here, within the bones of the priory, there was only the logic of stone and the truth of the math. She was mending more than just a house. She was mending the broken narrative of her family's life, one calculated measurement at a time. The smoke from the small fire began to curl toward the ceiling, and as it reached the central pillar, it was drawn upward into the hidden flue she had discovered earlier. The house was breathing with her now, its secret safe for one more day, held in the weighted, expectant stillness of a silence that was finally beginning to thaw. She sat by the fire, his journal, the equilibrium of stones, open on her lap. The leather was cracked, the pages yellowed by years of hiding in the damp cellar of the workhouse, but the ink was as dark and defiant as the day it was written. She traced the diagrams of the cantilevered arches, her mind working through the equations of pressure and resistance. She was the invisible woman, the one the world had discarded as worthless, but she held the key to a truth that would bring the powerful to their knees. As the flames licked the dry wood, casting long, dancing shadows against the limestone walls, Clara Sterling allowed herself a small, determined smile. The ransackers had taken the silver, but they had left her the crown, and she intended to use it to rebuild the kingdom they had tried so hard to destroy. The light of the fire flickered across the brass plumb line, turning it into a needle of gold against the dark floor. Clara watched the flame, her thoughts turning to the iron box and the documents it held. The Royal Survey records that would prove Lord Vane had built his estate on stolen crown land. Every brick in Vane's manor was a lie, a structural fraud that she alone had the power to expose. She closed the journal and leaned her head back against the cold stone, listening to the wind outside. It was a lonely sound, the sound of the world moving on without her. But inside Oakhaven, the silence was full of purpose. She had bought the ruin for $2, but the value of the silence it held was beyond any price a magistrate could ever tally. She closed her eyes, not to sleep, but to listen once more to the heartbeat of the house, ready for the labor that the morning would bring. The embers of the small fire had faded into a dull, pulsing orange by the time Clara Sterling reopened the brittle pages of the leather-bound journal. The smell of the book was a complex narrative in itself. The sharp, resinous scent of cedar oil mingled with the cloying sweetness of decaying parchment and the cold, mineral tang of the damp cellar where it had been hidden for so long. She ran a finger over her father's handwriting, the ink still possessing a crystalline sharpness that felt like a rebuke to the chaotic ruins surrounding her. Thomas Sterling had not merely been a surveyor. He had been a man who believed that the universe was a series of interlocking geometries, and that a lie was simply a calculation that refused to balance. As she studied the cross-sections of the eastern annex, Clara began to perform the mental accounting that the looters had been too ignorant to attempt. They had looked for a room with a door, but she was looking for the weight that did not belong. It was not merely a matter of measuring the empty space, but of weighing the silence of the house. Using a piece of charcoal in the margin of the journal, Clara began to tally the dead loads of the structure above her. The library, with its oak-beamed ceiling, and the remaining lead flashing of the roof, possessed a specific calculable mass. Based on the density of the Kentish limestone and the span of the joists, the central pillar should have been under a pressure of 60,000 pounds. However, as she recalculated the vectors of the arches and the redirection of the force through the cantilevered walls, she realized the discrepancy was far greater than she had first imagined. The pillar was not merely shifted 6 inches. It was carrying an additional massive influx of phantom weight, 40,000 pounds, the mass of a small cathedral's altar or a mountain of hidden lead. It was a staggering figure, a physical impossibility for a structure that appeared to be a hollowed-out ruin. To the magistrate and the debt collectors, the library was a graveyard of stolen books. But to Clara, it was a massive structural counterweight. She understood now the genius of the cantilevered lie. The strong room was not a cavity carved into the wall. It was a pressurized chamber, hidden within the very spine of the pillar, held shut by immense structural tension. It was a vault that used gravity as its bolt and the entire mass of the structure as its tumbler. The looters could have hammered at these walls for a century and never breached them, for to break the stone was to trigger the collapse of the very treasure they sought. One did not open the heart of Oakhaven with a key. One opened it by solving the equation of its equilibrium. She sat in the stillness, the cold of the limestone floor seeping through her sarcenet skirts, and felt the precise shape of his protection. He had built this for her, a sanctuary of physics that required the mind he had trained rather than the wealth he had lost. The 4 marked points on the floor, traced with the charred wood, began to hum in her mind like the vertices of a geometric proof. If she could shift the center of gravity by a mere fraction of an inch at the base of the pillar, all that immense pressure would be redirected through the secondary notches, allowing the central stone to pivot. It was a terrifying prospect, the thought of releasing that much tension within a crumbling manor, but Clara felt a strange, cold clarity. She had shed the identity of the unseen girl at the auction. She was the variable that would finally bring the equation to its resolution. The morning arrived, not with a burst of light, but with a slow, grey infiltration of the mist that clung to the derelict gardens. Clara rose from her vigil, her limbs stiff and her hands trembling slightly from the biting chill, yet her purpose remained as solid as the masonry. She had no specialized tools, no crew of masons to assist her. She had only her brass plumb line, a heavy iron pry bar she had scavenged from the stable ruins, and the grueling singular focus of a woman who had nothing left to lose but her dignity. She began by stripping away the decorative limestone facing at the base of the central pillar, the chisel end of the pry bar biting into the mortar with a rhythmic, metallic rasp. Each strike sent a cloud of fine white dust into the air, coating her hair and her eyelashes until she looked like a marble statue emerging from the gloom. The labor was a meditation of grit and persistence. She worked with a clinical precision, mindful of the fact that the stones she was removing were not merely ornaments, but the outer skin of a complex machine. Beneath the first layer of ashlar, she found the true structural core, blocks of granite that had been fitted together with such tightness that even a needle could not pass between them. It was a mason's masterpiece, a hidden foundation that looked as fresh as the day it was laid, protected from the rot of the rest of the house by the very pressure that kept it sealed. As she cleared away the debris, the sweat began to bead on her forehead despite the cold, stinging her eyes and mixing with the limestone dust to form a grey paste upon her skin. She was listening for the sound of the house shifting, the minute groans of timber and the subtle clicks of settling stone. Every few inches, she stopped to check the plumb line, ensuring that the redirected weight was not causing the ceiling to drift. It was a dance of inches and ounces, a process of stripping back the lies of the architecture to find the honest bones beneath. Her hands, once soft and suited for the delicate work of a surveyor's assistant, were now raw and calloused, the skin of her palms stained with the rust of the pry bar and the oil of the ancient mortar. Yet, she felt a profound satisfaction in the labor. Each stone she removed brought her closer to the heart of the deception that had ruined her father, a physical dismantling of the injustice that had cast them into the shadows of the parish house. By midday, the base of the pillar lay exposed, a raw wound in the gallery's elegance that revealed a massive circular pivot stone. It was here that the concentrated hidden burden converged, a singular point of pressure that acted as the vault's combination lock. Clara knelt in the dust, her breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps, and pressed her hand against the granite. She could feel the vibration of the house intensified here, a low, rhythmic thrum that felt like a heartbeat. According to the notes in the equilibrium of stones, there was a secondary weight-bearing trigger, a lintel stone that acted as a safety catch. If she could remove the pressure from that lintel, the pivot would be free to turn. The task required more than just strength. It required the application of leverage at a precise mathematical angle. Clara positioned the iron bar beneath the edge of the lintel, using a smaller block of limestone as a fulcrum. She braced her feet against the solid floor and threw the full weight of her body against the bar, her muscles screaming under the strain. For a long, agonizing moment, nothing happened. The house remained silent, its 40,000 pounds of pressure refusing to yield to the efforts of a single woman in a faded dress. She closed her eyes, picturing the vectors of the force as her father had drawn them, and adjusted her grip by a fraction of an inch. Then she heard it, a sound like the sharp, crystalline crack of ice on a winter lake. It was the sound of the equilibrium breaking. The lintel stone shifted, not by an inch, but by a hair's breadth, and the low-frequency thrum of the pillar suddenly changed its pitch. The weight was moving. Clara didn't stop. She pushed harder, her heart hammering against her ribs with a violence that matched the shifting masonry. The pivot stone began to groan, a deep, tectonic sound that seemed to rise from the very foundations of Oakhaven Priory. Dust poured from the ceiling, a white shroud that obscured the room as the cantilevered arches above began to accept the redirected load. It was not an explosion, but a slow, majestic realignment. As the pressure left the central core, a vertical seam appeared in the granite, a line of darkness that grew wider as the pillar began to rotate. It was the strong room, revealing itself not as a hidden door, but as a hollowed-out spine within the house's own anatomy. Clara stepped back, her legs giving way as the pry bar clattered to the floor. She watched, breathless, as the massive stone column turned with a grace that defied its weight, opening a passage into a space that had been untouched by the looter's greed or the rot of time. The air that drifted out of the chamber was not stale, but carried the scent of dry paper and cold iron, the smell of a legacy that had been waiting for the only person who knew how to listen. She stood at the threshold of the secret, her body trembling with exhaustion and the sudden, overwhelming heat of triumph. Behind her, the ransacked gallery was a chaos of dust and debris, a testament to the violence of men who only understood what they could steal. But before her lay the silence of the vault, a sanctuary of truth that had been bought for $2 and a lifetime of being unseen. She reached into her pocket for a match, her fingers brushing the brass plumb line that had guided her home. She was about to enter the heartbeat of Oakhaven to find the fundamental truth that Julian Vane had tried so hard to bury. The sulfur match flared into a sharp, defiant spark, its sudden scent biting through the ancient, metallic chill of the air that had been trapped within the central pillar for nearly a decade. For a heartbeat, the flame struggled against the heavy, oxygen-thin atmosphere of the hollowed spine, casting long, distorted shadows that leaped against the smooth, unweathered granite of the interior. Clara Sterling held the match with a hand that trembled not from fear, but from the quiet realization of what it meant to be the only person in the world who knew the truth. The matchlight revealed a space that was not a room in the traditional sense, but a vertical sanctuary, a narrow, meticulously engineered shaft that rose upward into the dark heart of the wing. This was the haunting geometry of his silence, a structure built on the principle that the safest place to hide a legacy was within the very weight that the world used to crush it. She stepped over the threshold of the rotated stone, her boots crunching softly on a fine layer of granite dust that had never been disturbed by the heavy, careless feet of Lord Vane's debt collectors. The temperature inside the spine was constant, the biting, stagnant chill of a winter that had refused to end for her family. As the flame stabilized, Clara looked upward, tracing the internal lines of the cantilevered arches that she had only ever seen in the charcoal sketches of Thomas Sterling's journal. From the inside, the architecture was even more terrifyingly beautiful. A masterclass in shadow engineering where every stone was a counterweight, every joint a silent calculation of pressure and resistance. The looters had hammered at the external walls until their arms were weary, never suspecting that the true strength of Oakhaven Priory lay in this hollowed core, a structural void held in perfect stasis by 40,000 pounds of phantom load. The match burned low, the heat beginning to singe the pads of her calloused fingers. But before the light failed, she saw it, the iron box. It sat upon a reinforced stone plinth that was part of the pillar's own foundation, positioned at the very center of the pivot where the vibrations of the house were at their most quiet. It was a heavy, fireproof container, its surface coated in a layer of dark, protective oil that had kept the rust and the damp of Kent at bay. There were no ornate carvings, no gold filigree to attract the eye of a common thief. It was merely a utilitarian object of iron and rivets, possessing the same restrained and elegant dignity as the man who had hidden it here. Clara struck a second match, the flare illuminating the small circular keyhole that required no key, merely a specific, rhythmic sequence of pressure that her father had taught her years ago. As she knelt before the plinth, the cold of the granite floor seeped through her thin sarsenet skirts, reminding her of the distance between the girl who had played in these halls and the woman who now reclaimed them. She reached out, her fingers tracing the seam of the iron lid. This was the moment of restoration, the point where the ruins of her life met the foundation of her future. She closed her eyes, listening for the internal shift of the stone, listening for the subtle, internal groans of the house as it adjusted to the new equilibrium she had forced upon it. The cantilevered arches above her were breathing, a slow tectonic rhythm that felt like the pulse of a living thing. She was no longer a ghost in her own home. She was the architect of its revival, the variable that had finally made the equation of Oakhaven balance. The iron box did not yield easily. It required the same patient, disciplined labor that had defined her survival since the day Thomas Sterling was taken away. Clara applied the sequence of pressure to the lid. 3 sharp taps on the leading edge, a steady pull to the left, and a final downward force that mimicked the redirecting of the structural load. For a moment, There was only the sound of her own heartbeat, loud and erratic in the pressurized stillness of the shaft. Then, with a muffled click that sounded like a whispered promise, the internal mechanism released. The lid moved with a heavy, oiled smoothness, revealing a cache of documents that had been preserved in a state of crystalline perfection. The smell that rose from the box was the scent of dry ink and high-quality parchment, the smell of a truth that had been kept in perpetuity. She reached inside, her hand brushing against a thick bundle of papers bound with a ribbon of faded blue silk. These were the original, untampered Royal Survey records, the true ledgers of the county that Julian Vane had spent a fortune trying to destroy. As she pulled the first sheet from the bundle, the matchlight caught the heavy, embossed seal of the crown, a mark of authority that made the insults of Magistrate Wickham feel like the buzzing of distant flies. These were the structural truth, the physical evidence of a crime so vast that it would shake the very foundations of the local gentry. She unfolded the parchment, her eyes scanning the meticulous surveyor's lines that her father had drawn with such unwavering integrity. Her breath caught in her throat as she found the section detailing the boundaries of the Vane estate. According to the official records presented at her father's trial, Oakhaven had been a liability of debt, and the surrounding fields were the ancestral property of the Vane family. But here, in the true, unredacted survey, the reality was starkly different. Lord Vane's fortune was a cantilevered lie of its own, a structural fraud built upon crown land that he had never legally owned. He had moved the boundary stones, under the cover of a winter storm, bribed the previous magistrate to alter the parish ledgers, and then framed Thomas Sterling when the surveyor refused to certify the deception. Every acre of his sprawling manor, every brick in his newly built stables, was a theft from the crown, held only through the silence of a man who had been cast into a debtor's prison. Clara felt a wave of cold, crystalline fury wash over her, followed by a profound sense of poetic justice. The man who had mocked her for spending her last $2 on a ruin was himself a squatter on stolen ground. He had ransacked Oakhaven looking for gold, never realizing that the house held the very documents that would strip him of everything he possessed. She sat in the darkness of the vault, the match having burned out, and allowed the weight of the discovery to settle into her soul. She did not need light to see the path forward. The math was finally clear. The iron box held the deeds, the legal settlements, and the secret correspondence that proved the systematic dismantling of his reputation. It was a legacy of wisdom, not gold, and it was now hers to wield. She spent hours in the narrow shaft, guided by the tactile reality of the documents. She ran her fingers over the signatures of the royal commissioners, feeling the texture of the embossed seals and the crispness of the parchment that had never known the damp. There was a ledger at the bottom of the box, its pages filled with her father's private notes, a record of every bribe offered and every discrepancy he had found in the land titles of the region. It was a ledger of lost souls, a map of the social cruelty that had defined their lives for years. Thomas Sterling had known that he would be taken. He had known that the law would be turned against him, and so he had built this strong room not to hide from the world, but to wait for it. He had waited for the daughter who knew how to listen for the steady rhythm of the stone. The silence within these walls was no longer the silence of a tomb. It was the silence of a fortress. As Clara carefully repacked the iron box, her movements were precise and deliberate, the movements of a woman done performing for the gaze of the powerful. She was mending the broken narrative of her life with the same meticulous care she had used to strip the limestone from the pillar. She understood now that she had not bought Oakhaven to live in its past, but to secure its future. The $2 bid had been the legal anchor, the small, seemingly insignificant action that had given her the right to stand on this ground and reclaim the truth. Julian Vane had seen a penniless girl, but she was the only one who had been truly seeing him all along. When she finally emerged from the hollow spine, the grey light of the late afternoon was beginning to fade into the blue hour. That transitional time when the world feels suspended between what was and what will be. Clara stood in the center of the ransacked gallery, the dust still hanging in the air like a ghostly veil. She looked at the missing floorboards and the scarred walls with a new sense of clarity. She was not just mending a ruin, it was merely waiting for its restoration. She possessed the means to rebuild every joist and refinish every mahogany rail, not through the luck of a hidden treasure, but through the legal reclamation of a fortune that had been stolen from her family. She was the rightful steward of Oakhaven, and the bones of the house had finally recognized her. She walked toward the great hall, her footsteps echoing with a steady foundational rhythm. The cold draft from the broken windows no longer felt like a threat. It felt like a clearing wind. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the brass plumb line, the small weight catching the last of the light. She had spent a lifetime learning the exact contours of invisibility, the cold, the silence, and the social shaming that comes with being the daughter of a ruined man. But tonight, as she looked out over the derelict gardens toward the distant, stolen fields of the Vane estate, she knew that she was the most visible thing in the county. She held the truth in an iron box, and she had the integrity to see it through to the end. The loudest truths are often found in the quietest ledgers, hidden beneath the weight of a world that thinks it has already won. Clara closed the heavy oak door of the eastern corridor, the sound of the latch, a definitive, crystalline click that resonated through the empty halls. She was no longer mending a ruin, she was building a future from the very stones that had been meant to bury her. The evening did not arrive with a gentle descent of shadows, but with the heavy rhythmic thrum of horses' hooves, striking the rain-softened gravel of the driveway. Clara Sterling stood in the center of the foyer of the targeted annex, her hands still stained with the grey dust of the granite spine. She stood listening as the world of men and greed returned to reclaim what it believed she had no right to hold. The sound was a violation of the house's hard-won silence, a chaotic, unrefined noise that carried the scent of wet leather and the sharp, metallic tang of carriage wheels against stone. She did not move toward the boarded windows to peek through the cracks like a frightened tenant. Instead, she stood her ground, her spine as vertical and unyielding as the central pillar she had just mastered. In the pocket of her faded sarcenet gown, the heavy iron key felt like a secret heartbeat, a cold reminder that for $2 she had purchased not just a ruin, but the legal authority to forbid entry to the highest lord in Kent. Outside, the horses snorted and stamped, their breath blossoming in the damp air, like ghosts of the previous century's industry. Clara heard the sharp, authoritative crack of a whip against wood, followed by the low, murmuring voices of men who viewed Oakhaven Priory as a carcass to be stripped of its remaining hide. They were the scavengers Lord Vane had sent to finish the work, men with crowbars and hammers who did not know the language of stone, only the vocabulary of salvage. She recognized the vibration of a heavy carriage door being thrown open, the hinges groaning with a lack of grease. Then the sound of boots on the stone steps, a slow, deliberate tread that lacked the frantic pace of a looter. This was a man who walked with the arrogance of one who believed he owned the very air he breathed. The heavy oak door did not wait for a knock. It was struck by the head of a cane, a rhythmic, demanding sound that echoed through the vestibule. Clara walked toward the threshold, her footsteps sounding like a measured counting of the house's internal geometry. When she pulled the door open, the transition from the amber gloom of the foyer to the cold, blue light of the evening was a physical shock. Standing on the portico was Lord Vane, his tall silhouette framed by the flickering lanterns of his carriage. He was wrapped in a greatcoat of dark wool, the velvet collar shimmering with a fine mist of rain. Beside him stood a cluster of rough-hewn men, their faces obscured by the shadows of their caps, their hands gripping the iron tools of demolition. They looked like a pack of wolves standing before a solitary lamb, yet Clara felt only the precise, chilling clarity of her own resolve. Lord Vane did not speak immediately. He surveyed the girl before him with a gaze that was clinical and devoid of any human recognition, as if he were assessing a stray cat that had wandered into a warehouse. His eyes moved from her dusty hair to the frayed hem of her skirt, his lip curling in a display of social coldness that was more biting than the Kentish frost. He looked past her into the hollowed foyer, noting the small fire she had built and the single candle that flickered on a discarded crate. The sight seemed to amuse him, a dry, soundless laughter that manifested only in the tightening of the skin around his eyes. He had come to witness the final indignity of the Sterling name, to see the daughter of the man he had ruined shivering in the bones of a house she could not possibly maintain. "It is a curious thing, Miss Sterling, the way the desperate cling to the wreckage of their own failures," Lord Vane said, his voice a low, cultivated rasp that carried the weight of his unearned power. He stepped forward, his cane clicking against the limestone threshold, an invasive movement that ignored the boundaries of her ownership. "I had expected you to have fled to the parish by now, seeking an annuity for your penury. Instead, I find you playing house in a tomb. It is a pathetic display even for the daughter of an embezzler." He signaled to the men behind him with a flick of his gloved hand. "Move her aside. We are here for the lead and the ironwork. The house is to be leveled by the end of the month. There is no point in preserving the aesthetics of a ruin." The looters shifted, their heavy boots scraping the stone as they prepared to push past her, but Clara did not step back. She did not raise her voice, nor did she resort to the undignified melodrama of a plea. She simply reached into the folds of her gown and produced the deed of sale, the parchment crisp and white against the grey background of the foyer. The Royal Surveyor's seal, which she had recovered from the iron box, lay just beneath it, its crimson wax catching the lantern light like a drop of fresh blood. The men hesitated, their primitive instincts recognizing the presence of authority, even if they did not understand the nature of the documents she held. "The estate of Oakhaven Priory is no longer under your jurisdiction," Lord Vane, Clara said, her voice possessing the unwavering clarity of a bell struck in a frost-bound valley. It was sold at a public auction overseen by Magistrate Wickham. The bid was accepted, the deed was transferred, and the taxes have been satisfied by the $2 legal tender I provided. She looked past the nobleman to the men with the crowbars, her gaze steady and observational. "If you set foot across this lintel without my express invitation, you are not salvaging materials. You are committing a felony against a property owner of the Crown. I suggest you consider the weight of the law before you lift a single hammer." Lord Vane's face underwent a subtle, violent transformation, the mask of aristocratic boredom slipping to reveal a predatory rage that had been years in the making. He took a step closer, his breath smelling of expensive brandy and the cold damp of the exterior. The looters behind him remained still, caught in the sudden, silent tension between the girl in the faded dress and the man who held their livelihoods in his hands. It was a confrontation built not on strength, but on the precise mathematical application of legal truth. Lord Vane looked at the deed, his eyes scanning the signatures with a desperate, searching intensity, looking for the flaw in the math that would allow him to crush her once again. The silence that followed was not empty. It was a pressurized void, the very atmosphere of a secret that was about to be exhaled. Lord Vane reached out as if to snatch the parchment from her hand, but Clara withdrew it with a grace that was as disciplined as her father's surveying lines. She had ceased to be the invisible girl of the workhouse. She was the cornerstone of Oakhaven, and the weight of the entire house was behind her. "You are a squatter in your own mind, Julian," she whispered, using his first name as a deliberate stripping of his social armor. "You think you can take what you want, because you have forgotten that the bones of the thing are always more honest than the words of a thief." Lord Vane did not retreat, but he stilled, his fingers gripping the silver head of his cane until his knuckles turned as white as the limestone dust on Clara's hands. He looked at her, not with contempt, but with a growing, cold realization that the ruin he had sold for $2 possessed a heartbeat he had never bothered to listen for. He looked at the iron box, the heavy, unmoving presence she had placed on the small crate just inside the door, and for the first time, the predator felt the sharp, metallic bite of the trap he had inadvertently walked into. The looters behind Lord Vane began to mutter, the sound of their uncertainty like the dry rustle of dead leaves against the stone. They were men of the earth and the forge. They understood the power of a deed and the finality of a crown seal. One by one, they lowered their crowbars, the iron striking the gravel with a series of dull, final thuds. They were looking at Clara now, not as a nuisance, but as the mistress of a fortress they had no right to enter. The social dynamic of the county was shifting in the blue light of the evening, the weight of the past falling away to reveal a new, terrifyingly honest foundation. Clara watched Lord Vane, noting the way the lantern light played across the sharp angles of his face. He was a man built on the cantilevered lie of his own heritage, a structure that was finally beginning to sag under the phantom load of his crimes. "I did not buy this house to live in its shadows," she said, her voice dropping to a register of quiet, devastating authority. "I bought it to find the map of your destruction. And as the ink dried on the ledgers tonight, I found exactly where the boundary stones were moved. You stole 300 acres of crown land and framed my father when he refused to certify the theft." She stepped back into the amber gloom of the foyer, the movement a definitive invitation for him to look upon the evidence of his own ruin. In the distance, the sound of a secondary carriage could be heard, the steady rhythmic pace of a legal official's gig. Clara knew it would be Mr. Penhaligon, the clerk who valued the letter of the law over the titles of men. She had sent word to him an hour ago, using the last of her energy to secure the presence of the only man in the county who could certify the truth she held in her hands. The wolves had returned to the priory to finish the ransack, but they had found that the lamb was now the architect of their judgment. Lord Vane looked from the approaching lanterns to the girl in the doorway, his eyes dark with a mixture of hatred and a nascent, shivering fear. He was a man who had built his empire on the silence of the Sterling family, and now that silence had been broken by the sound of a rotating pillar and a $2 bid, he did not move to strike her. He simply stood there, a tall, dark monument to a legacy that was being dismantled stone by stone. The air was thick with the scent of wood smoke and the cold, mineral breath of the house, a sensory anchor that grounded the moment in a physical reality Lord Vane could no longer ignore. "You will never see the inside of this strong room, Lord Vane," Clara murmured, her hand resting on the heavy oak door, "because to enter it, you would have to understand the math of a man who refused to flatter you. And you have forgotten how to listen for anything that does not serve your own greed." She began to close the door, the movement slow and deliberate, a physical sealing of the sanctuary she had reclaimed. The sound of the latch was a definitive, crystalline click that resonated through the vestibule, a sound that signaled the end of the looter's reign and the beginning of the restoration. As the door shut, the world of Lord Vane and his hired men was extinguished, replaced by the warm, flickering sanctuary of the interior. Clara leaned her back against the wood, her eyes closed, listening to the sound of the carriage wheels as they turned away from the threshold. The looters were leaving, their tools silent, their purpose defeated by the weight of a truth they could not carry. She was alone in the bones of Oakhaven once more, but it ceased to be a loneliness of isolation. It was the quiet, profound affairs of a woman who had finally been seen by her own heritage. The formal hearing did not take place in the grand, echoing halls of a London court, but in the smaller, more intimate confines of the magistrate's private chambers, a room that smelled of old tobacco, cold ashes, and the heavy, slightly cloying scent of beeswax. Barnaby Wickham sat behind his desk, the mahogany surface polished to a mirror shine that reflected the uneasy shift of his own features. He was a man who had spent decades enforcing the social hierarchies of Kent with the blunt instrument of his gavel. Yet today he looked at the iron box as if it were a dormant explosive. Beside him, Elias Penhaligon stood with his hands clasped behind his back, his meticulous, legalistic gaze never leaving the face of the man who had once mocked the daughter of a ruined surveyor. The air in the room was thick with a pressurized stillness, the specific gravity of a silence that exists only when the weight of a decade's worth of lies is about to be redirected by the simple, undeniable force of the truth. Clara Sterling sat in a hard-backed chair of carved oak, her spine perfectly vertical, her hands resting quietly in her lap. She wore the same gown of faded sarsenet that she had worn to the auction, but that fact no longer seemed to signify her poverty. Instead, it appeared as a badge of her quiet, unyielding resilience. Across from her, the Royal Survey records were spread out over the magistrate's desk, like a map of a forgotten kingdom. Each parchment, embossed with the crimson seal of the crown, was a geometric proof of her father's integrity. The ink, preserved within the vacuum of the cantilevered spine, possessed a crystalline sharpness that made the altered ledgers of the Vane estate look like the clumsy scrawls of a common thief. Clara watched as Wickham's fingers hovered over the documents, his breath coming in shallow, ragged plumes that betrayed the coldness of his heart. "These records," Magistrate Wickham began, his voice lacking its usual gravelly arrogance, "they are the original certificates of the 1805 survey. I recognize the hand of Thomas Sterling, but I also recognize the Royal Surveyor's warrant." He looked at Elias Penhaligon, seeking a loophole in the math of the situation, but found only the cold, clinical reality of the law. If these boundaries are correct, then the 300 acres currently claimed by the Vane family, the land upon which they built the new stables and the dower house, are in fact the property of the Crown, and the debt for which Oakhaven was seized. It was a fabrication of the local tax registers. "It was more than a fabrication, Barnaby," Elias Penhaligon murmured, his voice a steady, rhythmic sound that cut through the magistrate's hesitation. It was a systematic dismantling of a man's reputation to cover a land theft of historic proportions. Thomas Sterling did not embezzle the funds. He was framed because he refused to move the boundary stones for Lord Vane. These ledgers, found within the strong room that Clara Sterling alone had the knowledge to open, Provide the names of the witnesses who were bribed and the exact amounts paid to the previous tax clerk. The law does not merely require an apology. It requires the immediate restoration of the Sterling name and the restitution of all holdings seized under fraudulent pretense. The poetic justice of the moment was not lost on Clara. She looked at Wickham, remembering the way he had laughed as she placed her $2 bid in the mud of the courtyard. She remembered the early years, the way the world had looked through her, as if she were a ghost haunting the ruins of her own heritage. Now, she was the variable that had finally made the equation of the county balance. "I do not seek the ruin of the local gentry, magistrate," Clara said, her voice possessed of a restrained and elegant authority that silenced the room. "I seek only the foundational reality, the truth that was buried beneath the cantilevered arches of Oakhaven. My father was a man of the map and the measure. He deserved a world that respected the geometry of his character." The hearing concluded not with a public outcry, but with the quiet, scratching sound of a quill against parchment, as Wickham signed the official decree of exoneration. The records of the Royal Survey were entered into the evidence of the county, and a writ was issued for the immediate freeze of the Vane family's assets pending a Crown inquiry. Thomas Sterling's name, which had been a whispered synonym for betrayal for 10 years, was restored to its rightful place in the annals of the Kentish surveyors. As Clara stood to leave the room, she felt a profound sense of quietude settle over her, a feeling of restored safety that was more valuable than any amount of reclaimed gold. She had weathered the social coldness of the world, and she had emerged not as a victim, but as the architect of her own vindication. Outside the chambers, the spring air was beginning to carry the scent of apple blossoms and damp earth, the smell of a world that was waking up from a long, bitter winter. Clara walked through the village, and the people who had once looked away now paused to offer a quiet nod of respect. They did not know the details of the shadow engineering or the phantom loads, but they understood the language of a woman who had stood her ground against a wolf and won. She did not stop to flatter them, nor did she linger in her victory. She had a house to mend, a ruin that was waiting to be transformed back into a sanctuary. The $2 she had spent was no longer a joke. It was the foundation of a legacy that would be built with her own hands and the honest wealth of her restored heritage. The restoration of Oakhaven Priory did not happen overnight. It was a slow, meditative process of mending the broken and reclaiming the lost. For the first time in a decade, the sounds that filled the East Wing were not the sounds of scavengers and looters, but the steady, rhythmic pulse of manual labor. Clara Sterling stood in the center of the great hall, overseen by the skeleton of the grand staircase that was finally being rebuilt with seasoned mahogany. The air was thick with the scent of fresh pine sawdust, linseed oil, and the warm mineral breath of new mortar. She did not hire a fashionable architect to redesign the space. She followed the sketches in her father's journal, ensuring that every joist and every lintel was placed according to the honest math he had left behind. She spent her mornings with the masons, her calloused hands guiding the placement of the new limestone blocks. She spoke to them not as a distant mistress, but as a woman who understood the physics of their craft. They worked with a quiet diligence, moved by the sight of the owner herself measuring the tilt of the floors with a brass plumb line. There was a profound satisfaction in the competence pawn of the restoration. The way a sagging beam was jacked into place, the way the scarred plaster was smoothed over with layers of fine lime, and the way the boarded windows were replaced with panes of clear, shimmering glass that invited the sun back into the rooms. Oakhaven was no longer a carcass. It was a living body that was breathing once more, its structural lies replaced by the truth of its new foundations. The reclaimed wealth of the Sterling family, secured through the legal settlement with the Crown following the exposure of Lord Vane's fraud, was not spent on silk and vanity. It was spent on the essential structural core, on the repair of the roof, the clearing of the silted ponds, and the restoration of the surveyor's library. Clara moved into the manor fully, returning to a room that looked out over the gardens. She spent her evenings in the library, the iron box now sitting openly on a desk of dark oak, its contents a testament to the power of observation. She was the mistress of a fortress that required no secrets, a house that was as transparent and honest as a surveyor's map. One afternoon, as the sun began to dip toward the blue hour, Clara walked to the east wing. The central pillar, which had once been the hinge of her father's secret, was now a marvel of architectural history, its granite core left exposed as a reminder of the strength that had saved them. The cantilevered arches had been reinforced, the phantom load redirected through visible, elegant supports that honored the genius of the original design. She stood in the quiet of the gallery, the air smelling of beeswax and old leather, and felt the exact temperature of a silence that was full of contentment rather than fear. She was no longer the invisible woman. She was the cornerstone of her world, a woman who had been seen and mended by her own labor. She walked toward the heavy oak door that led to the gardens, her fingers brushing the brass latch. It was a simple object, yet it represented the finality of her journey. She looked back at the house, at the polished floors, and the light that danced across the newly painted walls, and she knew that Thomas Sterling would have approved of the geometry of this new life. She reached into the pocket of her gown, now a fine, sturdy wool that reflected her new station, and pulled out the heavy iron key. She stepped outside, the cool evening air brushing against her face, and turned back to look at Oakhaven Priory. The house stood with a quiet dignity, its ruins forgotten, its heritage restored. Clara inserted the key into the lock, and the sound of the tumblers turning was a definitive, crystalline click that echoed through the garden. It was the sound of a sanctuary being sealed, a sound of safety that belonged to her by right of law, by right of labor, and by right of love. She had spent an hour learning how to vanish completely, and now she stood in the ordinary light, fully witnessed by the home she had built from the stones the world had discarded. The lock was no longer a mechanism of shadow engineering. It was a simple, honest barrier between her peace and the world she had outlasted. Tell me, have you ever felt the peace of being truly seen after a long winter of isolation? Where is the ruin in your life that you are currently mending with your own hands? Share the name of the sanctuary you are building tonight. From which quiet corner of the map are you listening to the sound of this key turning? Share your location and your thoughts of restoration in the comments below.